Hi, this is Gary with MACMOST.com. Let's take a look at language, region, and input source settings in macOS Ventura. MACMOST is brought to you thanks to a great group of more than 1,000 supporters. Go to MACMOST.com/Patreon. There you could read more about the Patreon campaign, join us, and get exclusive content and course discounts. So sometimes you need to deal with different languages, regions, and also keyboards on your Mac. For instance, you may move between countries or work on documents that come from around the world. And you may have a keyboard that may be specific to a region, but you want to switch it to a different region. Let's take a look at all those settings and how they work in macOS Ventura. So let's start by going to System Settings and then General. And one of the options here is Language and Region. So this is where you would go to add languages to your Mac. Languages are used by the operating system and various apps for things like the menu items, buttons, all sorts of text everywhere. And you can easily use the plus button here and select another language from the list. Every time you add a new language, it asks you if you want to make that the default language or stick with the current default. You can also change the order of these languages. So you can select one and drag it up. If you drag one up to the top, it will change the default language on your Mac. And when you change the default language, you need to log out and log back in or restart for that change to take effect. Then you would see all of the interface elements on your Mac and probably in all the apps you use as well change to that language. Now when you have multiple languages here, you also have the option to apply this to the login window. Since the login window is outside of any user account, it's possible to have several user accounts using different languages. So this allows you to say that you want the selected language to be the language used by the login screen. Now the order of languages here is important. If an app you're using doesn't have your preferred language, then it will use the first one in the list that it has that language for. So for instance, if your primary language here was French, but the app you're using only has interface elements for English and Spanish, then it would take English and Spanish, whichever is next. And the same will go for a lot of web pages as well. Now in addition to these settings, you also can set a region. And a region is really important because it allows you to make various decisions about how you want things to appear. Now you'll see these take immediate effect when you make changes. For instance, let me bring up the calendar here. And if I switch the first day of the week to Monday, you can see it instantly changes the calendar app because the calendar app listens to this setting when deciding how to display things. With the weather app here, I've got the temperature in Fahrenheit, but if I were to switch to Celsius, then the weather app instantly updates. In the Finder here, if you narrow the column down, then you'll see dates represented with slashes between the numbers. So I can change the date format like that, and now you can see it uses that in the Finder instead. Now a couple times I've already gotten the question, how can you switch the comma and period use in numbers? For instance, in the United States here, if you have a number like 1000, and in the cell formatting in numbers, if you set a 1000 separator, you get a comma. And if I add some decimal places there, you can see it uses a period for that. Now I think the setting here for swapping comma and period would be here in this list. And actually it is. But it depends on what region you're using. So the United States region isn't marked by Apple as having more than one option. But if I were to switch to another region, like let's switch to France here, you can see now there's number format. And with France as my region, I can choose a space as the 1000 separator and a comma as the decimal point. Or commas as the 1000 separator and a period as the decimal point. If I switch this to Germany, then I get periods as the 1000 separator as one option. So I can switch to that. And notice here if I go back to numbers, it switches automatically. Notice also you get different date formats depending upon the region. So here are the 3 different formats for Germany. The first 2 show the day first and then the month. But if I switch back to the United States, you can see my date formats are only month and then day or year, month, day with dashes. Now you have another option here at the bottom, and it's for individual applications to have different languages. So I can select an application, like say the weather app, and I could change that to use another language, to Danish for instance, and add that as a different app. Now when I run weather, you'll notice that the menu items and everything are in Danish, whereas when I go to another app, like say back into numbers, everything here is in English. If we want to remove the customization for a single app, you can select it and then hit the minus button. there are a bunch of other places where you can specify a language. So at the bottom here you've got translation languages. And you can actually download more translation languages to use. And also there's an on-device mode where it will always do the translation on your device. It won't send it into Apple for a quick translation there. In Siri and Spotlight you could also set the language for Siri. And once you choose a language you can choose a voice as well. Also down under Keyboard, if you look at dictation you can choose a dictation language. You can add from a variety of languages that Apple has available as being compatible with dictation. So if you're dictating text, make sure this is set to the right language for you. Now you can also set language for spell check. So if you go into an app like Pages here, if you look under Edit and then Spelling and Grammar, select Show Spelling and Grammar, which is simply the Command, Shift, and the semicolon key on US keyboards, and then you'll see the spell checker come up here, and this is where you have the setting for language. And you can leave it at automatic by language, which is what I have here. And that's why there's no spelling mistakes found here even though one line is in English and one line's in French. It will definitely find spelling mistakes. If I were to add a character here, for instance, you could see it knows that's spelled wrong. And if I were to switch from automatic by language to French, you could see it sees a bunch of spelling mistakes in the English line now. And if I switch to US English, it's going to see a bunch of mistakes in the French line now. Only with automatic by language does it pick up that I'm using one language here and one language there. You also have an accessibility here under voice control, the ability to set a language for voice control. And you can add a language here like that, and then it appears in the list. Now another place you need to deal with language related settings is in keyboard settings. If you go down to keyboard settings here, there's a section called Input Sources. So this deals with the specific type of keyboard you've got. If you bought your Mac in the United States you have a US keyboard. But if you bought it in another country you may have a keyboard specific to that country instead. You can edit the input sources here and you can see a list of them. I've added a few here. If you select one of these you can see the keyboard layout for that particular type of keyboard. So for instance I can see Q and W are the top left letters. And if I go to Canadian and British it's the same. But if I switch to this keyboard here it's got A and Z instead of Q and W there. And if I leave it at that, then when I actually type with those keys, even though it says Q and W on my US keyboard, I'm going to get A and Z. Now if you go to all input sources here you're going to get all these options. One of them is Show Input Menu in the menu bar. I've got that turned on and you can see it right here. And I could switch between the four keyboards I've chosen very easily now. And a really neat thing you can do here is select Automatically Switch to a document's input source. So I'm going to turn that on. So you can see I'm in this document here. If I change this document to use this particular type of keyboard, you can see it indicates it there. Now I'm going to create a new document. And in the second document I'm going to switch to a US keyboard. Now when I switch between these two documents, notice how it automatically switches to the keyboard for each one. That's all because of this switch right here. Now you also have a language selection here for spelling that looks a lot like what we saw in Pages before. And that's because this is the default here. So automatic by language is the default. If I change it to US English, notice if I switch back to Pages here it now says US English here in Spelling and Grammar. So any app that actually has the default spelling and grammar control will obey the default method from this system setting. Another setting that you've got under keyboard you should probably know about is if you go to keyboard shortcuts there's a section here for input sources. And you see your control space selects the previous input source and control option space is the next one. So it's the same as switching here. It's just something you can do with your hands on the keyboard. So control space brings up this list here and I can continue to look through the list. When I get to the one I want I just release control. So that's a look at all the different settings for language, region, and input sources in macOS Ventura. Hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, click the thumbs up button below to let me know. I publish new tutorials each weekday. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out.